Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Food Fraud Annual Update, Preview and List of Concerns. My name is Chris Reno, and I'm the moderator of today's event. First, we're going to talk about some housekeeping. Kindly note that all attendees remain muted throughout today's duration of today's webinar. Should you have any questions for our presenters during today's topic, we encourage you to use the designated question tab within your GoToWebinar control panel. A copy of the slides of today's recording will also be available on our website after the presentation. So for an intro today, we've got Dr. John Spink joining us from Michigan State University. John has been the director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State since 2013. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and we'll get started with today's presentation.
Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome. All right. I'm getting used to the touch. We've only done this a million times, haven't we? And all of a sudden, then the computers act up on us. So, welcome everybody. Thanks again for PJR. Great partner for me. Been great to get out to you, and all of you out there. You're the ones that are doing the real work. So you need to let us know if there's some questions you have or some things in here that are just more questions. Everything that we do comes from you giving us some direction. So it's been interesting. This summer started with the SSAFE board meeting. I don't know if you know them, but they're a group of food companies. The Food Safety Summit. Went to Latin American Food Safety Conference. Happened to be in Cancun. Not bad. It was great in April, coming from Michigan. And then I just got back from IAFP and IFT. And so had a lot of insight and listened to a lot of people. And one of the big things that I saw was this whole idea of annual update, looking at what's going on with food fraud for your company and food fraud prevention, and to look at a little bit about case studies and document fraud beyond just what's next. So that's what I'll be covering today. So just first, if you don't know about us, a reminder: research, education, and outreach. Talking to you, even talking before this call with Chris and the team, we got some insight, and so that'll lead me to go do some research. I guess I'm wired for this. I mean, I can't help myself. Is that all of a sudden some questions come up, and I've got to go look it up. I've got to go see what they're doing in Europe or wherever, or other examples, and so it's great to get that. So that's our cycle there. The way that when everything's there in a food fraud prevention textbook. So if you're starting to food fraud or looking at details, that's the core reference. We have these massive open online courses. They're free training courses developed with industry and agencies, looking at the background. The content's always free. There's an administrative fee for a certificate. There's core concepts, and then there's also I'm trying to advance the slide. I'm not getting the next click. What's happening here? Oh, there we go. Specialty. Now it's coming. The next. I'm not sure if I have control here, or it's just slow. Maybe it's slow. We have other MOOCs, and then going down the page, we have our USDA training that we did with them, have a master's certificate. We do workshops, things like that. So there's a lot of ways you can interact with us, and if you need more, either talk to PJR or talk to us. And just as a reminder, boy, it's been interesting to sit in the sessions in the food safety conferences, the food science conferences this summer, and really realizing that we a lot of times work within our silos, and that's human nature. We apply the tools we have and the tools we're familiar with to a common problem. The thing with food fraud is it's not a simple problem. And I see at the bottom there is, food safety, food authenticity. That's the way we start because we're food safety people and we have food safety tools. But in reality, the bad guys are humans and not microbes. So we don't go to biology, we go to criminology. And then thinking about standards and certifications, we need to have some structured ways to approach this. And that's where PJR comes in, looking at the certifications and standards. And then we need to manage it. And that's partially the food safety management standards help us put processes in place that help us communicate upwards. And eventually getting to this just being a natural old simple thing, food fraud prevention, just like HACCP, just like food safe, just like food quality, just like quality management, into supply chain management. That's where I am now. I'm actually a professor in the in the business college and in supply chain management. So it's interesting to look at this and apply all these disciplines down to some things that are pretty simple. So the reminder, annual update. This is really important to go back to this. In this year, the rest of this year, you're going to see us emphasizing this a lot, is the gap analysis. We're going to have a survey coming out, but it really starts with these questions and you to look at yourself of how you're doing. And I think, again, working with the auditors and the certification bodies is really key to this. We break it down to some really simple questions. And the case studies I'll give a little later will help perspective on these questions. So first is, have you conducted a food fraud vulnerability assessment? Probably you have, maybe not on all products. Is it written? Right there is a key. Is it in? So if you're asking this question of yourself or of your suppliers, both are key questions, is to then see a document, because you can't complete an audit if someone doesn't show you something. You can't just say you're doing it, you need to demonstrate it. Do you have a food fraud prevention strategy? Now, this also is a key to say, is it written? 1 second here. So right there is a lot of times people do one little thing, or second little thing on food fraud, but they don't have an overall comprehensive strategy. Demonstrate implementation. This has continued to be one of the top 10 nonconformities for all food safety issues, not just for food fraud, but for all food safety, is demonstrate implementation for food fraud. You might as well you might have done a few things, but not continually, not updated it. So think about a HACCP plan and what you have in there, how you record it, how you document it, how you present it to auditors. It's the same thing as looking at food fraud in general, you know, the how you record meetings and demonstrate who's on the team. Executive level sign off. This is the most impactful item of these, and it sounds so simple, that a boss signed it and agreed with it, approved it. And a key is officer of the company, an executive. Now they realize that they don't just sign their name and it's just nothing. It's not like us if you're a whatever sales rep or whatever you are, professor, me signing something, I don't represent all of MSU. Someone that's an executive officer of the company does. They legally represent it, and they realize their signature is binding. So if you see an executive, an officer of the company sign off on the plan, the strategy, the assessment, then you realize that they are saying their company officially endorses it. That's a key. It's not just some low-level person that just made it up. So that's a key, and we're looking at that more and more. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. This has been a big problem. People haven't looked at their entire portfolio every year. They respond to specific problems. The question gets to be, should you do that? Do you need to do that? Well, you do need to do that because it's required by the compliance issues, but you really need to do this as well. It's like going to your doctor for an annual review or annual checkup. You don't know what's wrong with you, but you go to check. I mean, you can't see the mole on the back of your back, and that's what you go to the doctor for. Also, if there's different issues, things going on in the world, maybe there's a new vitamin that people should be taking for something, then you want them to spot it early. That's why you do an annual review of all products. Method to review your incidents, general market incidents. So this is just like you again. How would you go about solving your medical problems? Do you have a methodical way, a standard way to look at your incidents and then share that information, but also market incidents? Things happen out in the world, like when there was lead chromate in cinnamon. Did you do anything about that? If you didn't, you missed a huge opportunity. Address all types of food fraud, just confirming that you do. A lot of people don't. They look only at adulterant substances, not at stolen goods, not at possibly buying counterfeit product. And then address all products, incoming goods, all the way through to the consumer, you selling products. I want to say a note about the address all types of food fraud. I don't know if you follow, I do a blog once a week usually. They're not just simple things. I don't talk about what I ate for lunch or anything. But a couple weeks ago, I did one on counterfeit titanium that was found reportedly in airplanes, airplane parts. That is a major concern. And one of the things there is buying product that's unauthorized or counterfeit or substandard is a big problem. So right there is that kind of awareness is a real key. That's why you want to broaden your food fraud perspective to everything, because anything out there in the world can cause a problem, not just an adulterant substance, not just horse meat and beef or something like that. That's why we're going to go in to look at some case studies and looking at documents. So, oops, you jumped ahead a little bit, but that's all right. I'll go back one. We're going to look at organic fertilizer, and that's way upstream, so you don't have a lot of visibility to that. Horse meat, and then document information fraud, and that's a next key research project for us. We have 2 papers that we're just finishing before submitting, before we'll go out and have primer documents and training and MOOCs and things like that. But document fraud is a real key, as you'll see. So to just review the chronology of incidents for food fraud, and that helps us to understand where we are and why it's changing now. So originally 2004, 2007 was Sudan red and melamine. Sudan red was a carcinogen colorant that was put into, like an industrial colorant that was put into food, and it's bright, it's reddish, bright, and it went in to make things like paprika or sauces look brighter. Consumers like that. Now, it was not good for us because it's a carcinogen. Melamine is a plasticizer, helps make plastic bottles soft. So it's used legitimately, but it was put in product to deceive protein tests, and that was the key. So that's kind of got us thinking. And then along the way came horse meat. And that's when GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative, which is the base of all the major food safety management systems, really started to take a look at it. At this point, it was no longer a one-off. It started to be something that was really significant and something where the food industry said, we need to do something really methodical. And that's looking at food fraud prevention. Then there's a lot of new food fraud compliance requirements. Back then, it was just get started. That was GFSI. And then usually about 2 years later is when standards start to really take hold, because the first year you're just complying, and the second year you do it and you say, well, we probably should do a little bit more. So that's when things were just starting to get rolling. The thing with that is, at that point, then COVID hit. And as I was working in supply chain management, then the big thing was just assurance of supply. You're trying to figure out how to get Zoom and your microphone and things like that. So there was less focus on the proactive work. And then inflation, after that, we've got inflation, Ukraine, Russia, Middle East, things like that. A lot of turmoil around the world is leading to supply chain disruptions. I'm not making those other issues minor, but we're looking at food fraud and supply chain here. So inflation, Ukraine, Russia is occurring. And then cinnamon and applesauce, and honey in the EU and in the US. So really, in the US, we've looked a lot at cinnamon. It seems to be dying off a little bit of the focus. It seems it's not. Agencies are looking closely at things like lead chromate, and they're testing more and more, and that's raising the awareness. In Europe, honey has been a big key. They have a lot of very regional designated origin products, and so they're really looking at honey there. So all of a sudden then we are moving along, and 2024, here we are halfway through the year, increased focus on supply chain disruptions and related risks. So this is a board of directors of companies, this is regulators, this is food industry as well. And what we've got is this whole big focus on uncertainty, enterprise risk management, that's a whole nother series of MOOCs and programs. There are new risks, but they're the same vulnerabilities. And as you'll see from the case studies, that's really the case. The incidents from the fraudsters are really simple. And the thing that's great is the same basic procedures apply. So that's really important, that what we're already doing, we just need to apply really rigorously. Auditors are getting more thorough, partially pushed by the retailers and the suppliers. So that's a real key, that maybe there hasn't been, well, auditors are also learning to be more effective in the way that they approach food fraud. And we're seeing these other issues like lead chromate in cinnamon, is that there's some really serious incidents out there. So we do see that auditors themselves are becoming more educated on this and increasing their focus. Really, it's time to get a lot more formal, and that's what we see from all the discussions with the food industry. Companies are assigning people to this task, and over this next year, I believe you'll see a lot more focus on food fraud, and really just maybe not more effort, more activity, but just a lot more formality in that. So let's get on to the fun stuff. I've been talking a lot so much about the I guess the formality of it and the rigor, and I like talking about the case studies. That's where we really get into the details. We're gonna have a little fun today. I don't know if I tell my students as well, my definition of fun might be a little different than other people's, but hey, that you need me to be that way. So this was from a National Organic Program USDA training course, and these are a couple of the concepts. And one of them we're gonna look at here is fertilizer, and it was substitution at the source. And it was found, what was done was a market review of all this product, and the technology used was kind of tracing it, and the trigger was a suspicious activity. So what happened was a fertilizer supplier switched to non-certified ingredients. So what happened was is that let's say it's a manure type product, they mix it up with water, and it goes through pipes, and it's sprayed over the crops. Now there's a certain time period you can't do it within 14 days of harvest, things like that, because it sprays. I mean, it is manure, but it then would wash off and it gets into the soil then. So they're spraying it, but the thing was is that it can clog up the nozzles. So they put some other processing aids in there that were not certified, not organic, that helped that product get across the field. So there was a marketplace review because it identified suspicious activity. Some other chemicals were showing up in the product. They didn't know where it came from. The technology used, they went back to the supplier, of the organic fertilizer supplier, and they did investigation, which was mass balance, meaning that you buy a certain amount of product. Well, let's say that you sell 1,000 bananas, then you need to be buying at least 1,000 bananas. You can't sell 1,000 bananas if you buy 800 bananas. You probably have to buy a few more because there could be damage. That's mass balance. The mass is balanced. And they also looked at document traceability of product coming in. They also looked at the warehouse to see what else they bought. And that's for finding some products that were not on the approved list. And this whole activity started with suspicious activity. And so there were just some concerns in the marketplace, and they started to do some investigations. The more we learn about the details of incidents, the more we can put processes in place to find them. If you know what type of fraud's occurring, then you can be looking for it. So when there was this type of processing aid, then that's something that could be looked at in the product that was received. So this was overall detail. The case study provided, public records, which was a key for us, because we want to find as much information as possible. Just knowing about an incident is one thing, but it's another if you can actually find court documents, because court documents are very, very detailed. Now, there's not too many of them, but we don't need very many to understand how these cases occur. So we reviewed the charges and prosecution. We looked at the violation that led to the prosecution. We learned the details of organic fraud. We considered the impact on the perpetrator, so on them and us, the impact on both of us, and because we want to discourage people from committing fraud. We looked into public documents, and that was a key for us. So that was again a real key, real court trial details. If any of you know of any court trials, whether it's your product or others, let us know, because we can find those documents and we can get them and use them, because they're public record at that point. And what we're looking along the way here is to see how to identify fraud opportunities, but also how we can operate so that we can more quickly prosecute these cases. Or if we just put the processes in place to require documentation that could be used in court, the bad guys will reduce their activities, because they know at what point they're making this. It's one thing if they just ship it to you and just handshake and say, oh yeah, it's all certified. It's another if they have to provide the documentation. That's a key. Bad guys don't like to leave their fingerprints. And if they have to give you documentation, then number one, it gives us a way to trace and track it. But it's another is them committing it's no longer just confusion. It's then an actual act of action. So we want to look at what type of documentation or assessment was critical to finding the fraud and assisting in successful prosecution. Those two go together. Again, like I said, that the fraudsters, if they're committing fraud to you, and they know if they have to now give you a document, they know they know what they're doing that could lead to them getting caught later. It's like if there's a video camera under an ATM machine, then the bad guy's going to cover their face before they come up and try to mug you. And if you see someone walking up with their face covered, that's different than someone uncovered. So we're reducing the fraud opportunity by understanding the documentation. So this person got real federal prison time in federal prisons for real. That's not a country club prison. Got about a year in jail, $125,000 fine. Now that doesn't seem like a lot. Well, maybe it seems like a lot to people that don't want to worry about crime, but if you're a criminal, that's not too bad, especially if you make a lot of money. And what we did see here is the counts were mail fraud. What's key about this is us and documentation. If we have documentation, then that's where we can identify the mail fraud. Now, it seems very unsatisfying to put someone away, prosecute them for mail fraud when they've done all these other bad activities. But the key is we're trying to find the simplest way to get the prosecution, to get the person to not be operating. Al Capone, the great criminal mastermind in Chicago, was put in jail for tax evasion. Now that's, again, that seems very unsatisfying, but the bottom line is he went to prison for the rest of his life. That's the bottom line. So that's where documentation comes in, is so important. And so, but this occurred for a long time. So even though he has this smaller fine, he's out of business already. But they wanted to make sure to still have this prosecution going on. So it was that many years. Made $6.5 million sales in total, and then it's hard to understand how much of that was of the gross sales increased because of this scheme. But anyway, the guy's out of business and in jail and paying fines for this. So right there is anybody that's going to start to think about committing fraud, as long as this information is known, they know that there's a good chance they could get caught. Most people would prefer not to go to prison and prefer not to be a convicted felon. So there is documentation in there. Actually, we spend about 2 hours on these documents in some of the longer food fraud courses. But the bottom line, there's information there. A grand jury was issued for this, or put together for this, and that's really, really serious. That's another thing. The bad guys that are really aware of committing acts, when they see that a grand jury address this, then that raises the bar, and it leads people to not want to be involved in this. It was a scheme to defraud, as was noted. So the thing that they provided, the information about their processing, talked about the liquid fertilizer and what they were using, and then the scheme was that they put in this other product without putting it on the label. That's real key. Again, the detail there is not as important for our discussion today. What is important is to look at the counts and the issues, because the thing is, we want to understand the documents we should be gathering so that we can, number one, dissuade them. Well, first off, it's to figure out what's going on with the Fraud Act. And that's if we collect details, then we have records that we can go to without asking them for it. And then second, we can look at how the prosecution occurs, which leads the bad guys to not want to commit the act if they have to give you documentation. One was conspiracy to commit mail fraud. The thing is that it happened that these invoices were sent in the mail. They weren't just emailed, physical mail. So right there is a process to possibly require the physical paper. They had a material scheme, used the mails, and the annual renewal was in the mail, and that led it to be an evidence of a paper trail. Documents, paper. They mailed the invoices and they mailed the annual review. So even if you ask someone to submit a document signed by their executive that they meet all your requirements, that right there could be evidence. That could be conspiracy. Next is other counts for mail fraud. And why, again, like I said, why is something more serious? It's because the efficiency of prosecution. Then false statements. So those are in there as well. They found them during discovery, that they put the crops at risk of decertification. That's a huge deal. So think about it, for a company that takes all the time to have that transition from conventional to organic, that it could have decertified their farms. They did not, which was lucky. So they looked at this. The losses were only applied to the fertilizer price. The problem with this for us, when we're looking at prevention, is that this is a supply chain. These are tiers. Upstream are tiers, downstream are echelons. Supply chain 101. And we look for hotspots. We look for where the fraud occurred or where it could occur. And in this case, it's on the inputs, way upstream. So if you're the retailer or someone downstream, then you might not be able to ever see this. If they did this and the product did wash off the product and it never got not into the leaves or into the product, you might never see it. But it still is not meeting these certification issues of the of organic. So the hotspots, we don't have any way to look at this yet, but that's where we're going to say then downstream, what are things that we could do that could at least give us some perspective on this? And part of it is knowing the types of things to test downstream. So understanding the situation is there is a fraud opportunity on the farm, and we need to think about not only the ingredients, but those agricultural inputs out there. And specifically, we look for, these are called hotspots, looking for where fraud could occur. The whole supply chain's there. You don't spend all your time looking at everything. You figure out the specific areas where you want the most activity or the most focus. And in this case, then, it could be asking those suppliers to confirm that they use the all organic products. And if they have to submit that, if they're aware of this type of fraud act and the prosecution, then they're not going to pursue that. They're not going to pursue this activity. So when we're looking at the tiers and echelons, it's really this indirect material supplier way upstream. And that there again emphasizes that. And when we look at actions or countermeasures, we want to reduce their temptation to act. Again, that's getting documentation from them. We want to increase the risk of getting caught or the cost of conducting the crime. So increasing the risk of getting caught is that if they then give that statement, that annual review that was submitted that said that they did comply, all of a sudden then if someone were to come in and test that product, so let's say that you, well, I mean, real simple would be if you're the farmer that bought this product, you could take a sample of the fertilizer and you can submit that. So right there is a real key. If your suppliers, like the farmers, do take samples of the fertilizer and check it just occasionally, or just keep retains, secure them, then that's something that could increase the risk of getting caught. Now, to increase the cost of conducting the crime would mean that they would need to find another product that would not show up, such as something that's actually organic. So maybe it's not exactly the fish meal that they said they were using, or the ground up shells of whatever, that they used something else. Then, but at least it would move the needle that they would look at organic product. So we want to emphasize reducing the fraud opportunity. We're not just trying to catch the bad guys. We're not just trying to detect it. We're not just trying to deter an action. We're trying to prevent it from occurring. So you want to take this idea of this specific incident and apply it to your entire supply chain of where else might there be some processing aids or other things that could cause problems. So we look specifically at detecting this, which would be taking samples of it from a suspicious supplier. Deterring would be taking samples of that liquid fertilizer and testing it occasionally, even if you completely trust the supplier, just to test. Even that'd be good to do just for quality control, for food safety. And then prevention is that overall plan to test more products. And again, the hotspot was very much at the very beginning. You could try to monitor them in their fields, but or in their shop, that's really difficult. They could come in the middle of the night and do it. So even if you monitor them 24/7, they could be deceptive. But the simple thing is at the end is receiving, is that whenever you receive product that you're paying a premium for some attribute, or there's something very specific about it that's important, you could test for that upon receiving. Now for prevention, if you're buying from the same suppliers, not just off the internet or Craigslist or whatever, then you don't need to do that many tests. But if you just do at least take retains of it or test it occasionally to confirm it is what it is, you can test against a reference sample or something, then that alone will vastly reduce your fraud opportunity. Just a lot of detail. Again, if we did sometimes we cover this whole thing in about 3 hours, 2 hours. So we're not going to cover those details here. Just advancing the slide. Advancing. All right, the next one is horse meat. I don't know if everybody's favorite or not, but this is another great example of food fraud in a different way. So we talked before about that fraud that occurred way upstream, that maybe even the fraud act, it's not even on the product or in the product yet, but it does violate the contract and possibly have that fertilizer be non-organic, which would lead the product that you make in the field, the product you use with that product could be not organic. This is a little different perspective. So we're looking at horse meat. There was species swapping. So There was a producer, and also then at a blender, there was a couple different schemes that were going on. Is that the goal was to buy beef, but horse meat was in there, and it was swapped in for whatever reason. Most likely the horse was less expensive, and there's a lot of parts of the world where horse is raised for human consumption. There's animals, food animals that are produced for to become food, and there's animals that are for other reasons, such as pets or domestic work animals. So this was a horse that was for human consumption. Who swapped it again? Most likely it was less costly. And then the trigger here for the activity we're talking about is they're looking at their plan, overall the food safety plan, food fraud prevention plan, and they're trying to prevent. We're looking at ways to trace and to authenticate the product as well, and we're trying to prevent. So horse meat was intentionally substituted for beef. We'll look at how to put a prevention plan in to consider the fraud opportunity. We're looking at traceability and authentication. And this scenario we're using here started with that effort to just reduce fraud prevention or prevent fraud. So the basics. HACCP is a general scope. If we're thinking about HACCP as a concept, that's food safety. We're building into HACCP and supporting it. So we're looking for health hazards that are significant. But really, food fraud is a prerequisite program in most cases. It could be a root cause, but it's not a known incident. And so things like looking at those conditions should be a part of it. So again, putting plans in place to prevent fraud is a part of a prerequisite program for HACCP. FDA talks about, and FSMA talks about a supply chain program. And in here, we're looking at these controls to prevent those hazards. And food fraud would be one of those. Now, food fraud, the tough part is that the vast majority of food fraud incidents do not have a public health threat. So that reduces the priority from a food safety standpoint. But it's still a root cause, and it could still put your company out of business. Even if it's not got a food safety incident, it could be a recall or just a lack of trust in you as a supplier. So the details of horse meat. I love this stuff. Actually, one of my colleagues, met him, was one of the first investigators working on this in the UK. It was fascinating to sit down with him. He has a great book on the topic. And just to hear it was amazing. So there's two incidents from Poland to Ireland and Europe to the UK. My colleague was the Europe to the UK, but also I worked with the Irish government on a number of different things. So to understand the Ireland track was also interesting. There was an article in The Guardian, commingled blocks of frozen meat. This is really deceptive handling. So these are 50-pound blocks of meat. They're like 12 inches by 2 feet by 2 feet, huge. And they're frost covered, they're frozen. So you couldn't just look at it and say, oh, there's horse, there's beef. You can't even see the meat. Plus it's all mixed up, and it's animal products. So it was blended in there. So they're big frozen blocks of meat. And some of them were found to contain 80% horse. And then someone says, oh, I'm just storing them for a buddy. Yeah, it's not my product. It's not my gun under the seat. It's not my drugs in the trunk. I'm holding the bag for somebody else. Yeah, right. So that's what a criminal would say. And they sold them along the way. And then that's how fraud that's how the meat got into the system. Now, interesting, when there were food safety tests or quality control tests on these, there was no food safety problems with this when they took some of it and melted it and checked it. But also it was a higher quality cut of meat, which is crazy that, it's maybe the beef was higher cost. They were more, lower end cuts of it. There was more muscle content, I think it was, that was in the horse. So they actually was a higher quality cut of meat. So what happened is here's an incident review of the product that went to the UK. I'm paraphrasing some of this, but it gets the point across. So what happened is a retailer in the UK, they have like a house brand or co-manufactured product. They don't make their own lasagna, but it's the lasagna brand only for them. So they're short on lasagna. They place an order. They want, let's say, 2 shipping containers of a beef lasagna. So they start the order process. It goes to their purchasing office, which happens to be over here in item number 2. So then they coordinate with their contract manufacturer, the manufacturing company, to order the 2 shipping containers. At that point, they then know how much pasta they need, how much meat sauce, how much beef, ground beef. So they then contact their purchasing office to go out to procure the product. They go to a worldwide web or European web of suppliers. Now, different people are specialized in different products and have different contracts and futures and this and that. So it goes to a broker or a bidder there. That happened to be Cyprus, then another person in Belgium and maybe Luxembourg. And then finally, it gets to the bid gets broken down enough to specifically ground beef to a butcher, a producer in Romania. It said Poland on there, but this incident happened to be Romania. So at that point, then they confirm, yes, we have product, and here's our bid, the winning bid. The information goes back to the coordinating office, the purchasing office, which then goes to the manufacturing plant to then start to coordinate the receipt of the product, when it's going to come in, how much, the format, things like that. So now if you look at this and say, okay, let's try to do traceability. Let's track that along. That's pretty rough because at this point, there's no product moving. These are all just bids, online, email, electronic documents. There's nobody takes ownership of the product. No one will touch it in the future. No one has touched it. They just have a specification. Basically, it's just like an online bid. So traceability here, or tracking people, who are these authorized partners, is really, really difficult. So we just said, okay, let's keep looking at this case, because we're looking for the simplest way to act. That's why you need to do supply chain mapping. So once that product came back in, the manufacturer just made that note that it was going to be shipped back, and they let the retailer know when it was going to be received. Now we'll look at what happened. The horse meat was commingled here way back at the start. That's a long way from everybody else. No one else is even in the same country. And that product then is, once the order is completed, the physical product is shipped to the co-manufacturing site. They make the lasagna, and the lasagna goes into the marketplace. Now, when we look at hotspot, this is supply chain mapping to know where things are going. And now we look at hotspots. So we see where the commingling occurred. And we also see the problem legally is there when it enters the marketplace. Those are 2 key hotspots. So you could test the product once you receive the finished product, once the grocery store gets it. But that's really difficult. You're talking about beef in pasta, in lasagna. It's already been cooked, and there's not a lot of beef in there related to the whole rest of the product. Now, at the other end of it, you could try to monitor those suppliers. But again, if they're criminal or fraudulent, they may use different facilities. They may hide and be really good at that. The hotspot that we haven't considered yet is at the point of receipt. And right there is key at point 9, where the product is received. That's where there's the most control. There's the most control at the exchange of goods and services. So the producer has given that product to you. You've received it, but you haven't paid for it yet. You're doing the quality control checks. At that point, if you do that check there, then you could reject the product. Now, key is if it's illegal product and it's crossed a border, then that could be smuggling. So if there's a process that as soon as you have find the concerning product, you contact the FDA and say U.S. Customs or Customs, in this case European Customs, then you lose possession of that product, and so do they. That the government takes it, probably seizes it, and destroys it. That's a lot of impact. That's the key. That's what you want. You want to find those places where you have the most control. Also, that hotspot at point 9 upon receipt is that if you just occasionally do a species test, take some of that block, break it down, and test the product for species. You don't have to test that much. Let's say that you're only buying from 3 suppliers, and this is one of them. Then it's not like, again, if it's a spot supplier, you check every time. But if you just do a few tests right there, that is the specific, most efficient place for you to conduct the hotspot analysis and to do that testing, and that would be have the maximum impact on prevention. A key here too is documentation. So to ask the supplier to confirm that it meets all the specifications, including species. Now, if they have to say that, then it becomes not a sin of omission, it becomes a sin of action. They can't just say, oh, sorry, we accidentally sent you a block of horse meat. No, then it gets to be that they've clearly stated that's what it was. Now, beyond that, you could ask for them to do a certification or a species test. That would then shift this to them either getting a species test and doctoring it, or faking one. And there again, if you're asking for that, then they have to give evidence, and that's a real key. So this is what then a simplified hotspot analysis looks like. This is the supply chain mapping. So we've got all the process steps. And in here we see where the mislabeling occurred. That was one of the incidents where the blender uh, they put it in there. Another place where there was an opportunity for the blending or problem. And then we had where it was found in the marketplace. Now, one thing is this, again, this is very difficult to test at this end compared to earlier, but you don't want to have the government be the ones that are doing the hotspot analysis testing for you. So in this case, we'll start to look at where you could do that intervention. So the hotspots are where crime occurs. Now, a key here is very at the end, you could do those countermeasures of authenticity tests at receiving. Now, you could either try to do that for receiving the finished product, the lasagna, but also then to ask your supplier to do that early on in the middle of the test. And that was a key, is looking at that technology for the species tests and to apply that there, really receiving the bulk product. Now, you could really look all the way back to the farm and to have traceability to the source. But if there's some type of fraud going on at the farm, then they could be doctoring those documents. So we want to have some traceability back there that helps a lot to know where it came from. But we want to combine that. It's called a multi-layered approach with doing some species tests a little bit later just to confirm the information that they have on there. Again, with the fraudsters, when Al Capone sees this, he's going to see that there's no way for him to commit a crime. And that's a key, that if you put these things in place, then even if you're buying from Al Capone, you'd prefer not to buy from a criminal. But if you do, then they're not going to see a fraud opportunity. That's the goal. That's where we combine the auditors, the audits, the certifications. We combine supply chain mapping, food fraud prevention, and then the document tracking to put that all together to just make you a hard target. So the last one I'll look through for a case study here is information not on the label. So it's one thing to look through. Let's look at the supply. So Lake Superior whitefish, and I looked up the scientific name there. So I live in Michigan, and Lake Superior whitefish is amazing. It's just fabulous. And what's key about this is the location being Lake Superior, not Lake Michigan, not just Great Lakes. It's Lake Superior. Lake Superior is a very deep, very cold lake. So the fish is just fabulous, and it's species. So that's a key. And this is on a lot of menus, and people want this. Then there's just whitefish. Whitefish could come still part of the species, but just not Lake Superior. Could come from one of the more shallow lakes, and that's just not as high quality premium of a product. But that's a species, not location. And you've got a whitefish, a fish that's white meat. So that could be any fish that's white. Could be farm raised tilapia from Colorado, which I actually saw that they have geothermal water that comes up, steam that comes up out of the ground, and they actually have tilapia in the middle of Colorado, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, so it could be a whitefish. Now, a key here is that's the scenario of the supply, and the Lake Superior whitefish has a very high price compared to a whitefish. So the scenario that we're looking at from a document fraud is how could things work. Now, if you are a restaurant and you love the whitefish that you buy from your supplier, that might be great, but it might not be Lake Superior whitefish. Why is that a problem? Number one is you're getting cheated, but there's ways we can look at this and think. In Michigan, the Michigan Department of Agriculture does the retail store audits, and they do the audits for the federal agencies as well, and they cover restaurants. One thing they do is they look at a menu item name. So you looking at the products you receive. Is it Lake Superior whitefish? Is it California avocados, whatever it is, Napa Valley cheese or something? So if there's a detail on there, that's what these auditors look for, or in this case, not auditors, but inspectors. If it says Lake Superior whitefish, what they'll do then is they'll look at the invoice. And that's called mass balance. Is that if you have on your menu Lake Superior whitefish and you show from your records you've sold 1,000 plates of that in the last year, then you should have bought at least 1,000 fillets. And if your invoices don't say Lake Superior whitefish, then that could be fraud. And there's been some situations where the restaurant didn't realize that they weren't buying that. And there was a kind of a insinuation that it was. So we're looking at documents here, and we want to look at the case study of this to understand where we're vulnerable and things we could ask for or look for when we're trying to reduce our own fraud opportunities. So again, looking at the documents you receive, such as the invoice, and look at how you're presenting it on your product, again, the label, which is another document, or your recipe, then to make sure that the invoice does say what it says it is, what you're buying. So food document fraud prevention, what we do is we look at supply chain mapping, we look at the transaction details, what you buy, and you especially focus on the value added statements. What documents are used to confirm those attributes? So if you do find something like Lake Superior whitefish, I mean, if you get the invoice of that and you buy from a regular fishmonger, then you're probably okay. How are those documents received or validated? That there is situations where people will fake the documents. You look at supply chain vulnerability mapping. We don't check every single thing. Every single thing isn't the most important. We want to look at this mapping to try to figure out what's going on. And this is emerging ongoing research for us. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I wanted to think about the annual review and update. It's going back to those key questions. And along the way is then how we can put things in place to help us along the way, which could be the documents. So the takeaway points, I always like to get this for my students and for all of you as well. What was he talking about? Annual update, start with the gap analysis questions. Mid-year is a good time to look at this because you may be looking at budgets or activities for next year. So go ahead and go through that gap analysis that was there at the beginning. Think about the processes you use, think about the documentation you use, how you look at documents. Review case studies and your incidents. That's a key thing. We looked at general case studies here, so you have a way, you've seen how we would look at these cases. Look at the incidents or suspicious activity for you. And that helps you identify where you have your vulnerabilities. And check with your standards and compliance audits. So work with PGAR and others to look at the results that you get. Look at the section on food fraud. Maybe I'd even have that as an idea for Chris, for us to work together to look back generically at some of the audits that you all have conducted to see where there are some of the shortfalls, and then maybe we can arrange some training based on that data. How did you do, and where are your gaps? Once you identify your gaps, then you've really got the question in detail. You can now look at the real answers and how to respond to it. So with that, Chris, we'll open back up for a discussion.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation today, John. We don't have any questions from the audience, so if you will give us about 24 hours to get this processed and get it sent out to everyone. If there are any questions and you want to reach out to John today, John, what's the best way for the audience to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think look at our website. We've got all of our contact information there, and that would be the way to do it. Also look for me on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. I know I always follow you on LinkedIn. You and I talk a lot about food fraud in the industry. It's always a hot topic, and I always enjoy hearing your presentation. So with that said, I really appreciate your time today, and we'll look for you next month. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.